There are moments in history when the world stops and listens, not because someone shouted the loudest, not because someone threatened with weapons, but because truth was spoken with such power that it left even the mightiest in silence. That is what happened when Jaishankar delivered his final strike, and in that single moment, the United States, a nation that has dominated conversations for decades, was silenced. It was not just a political exchange, it was a turning point, a declaration that the old order was shifting, that India was no longer waiting for permission to rise, that India had already risen. This was not a speech, this was not just diplomacy, this was history unfolding in real time, and the silence that followed was louder than any words America could have spoken. For too long, the West believed that power belonged to them alone, that they could walk into any room, dictate terms, and others would simply nod and follow. But India has been playing a different game. Quiet, patient, strategic. The kind of game where you let others believe you are still behind, when in reality you are constructing the foundations of something unstoppable. And when Jaishankar delivered that final strike, the mask was torn off. The United States realized that India had crossed the point of no return. No lectures, no pressure, no threats could undo what India had built. The silence that followed was the silence of recognition, of a world suddenly realizing that the balance of power had shifted eastward. Understand this, India's rise is not an accident. It is not charity. It is not borrowed. It is earned. Every ounce of progress, every moment of strength has been carved out of struggle, sacrifice, and relentless perseverance. A nation once seen as weak, colonized, divided, written off by so many, is now standing tall as the voice of the global South, as the bridge between East and West, as a civilizational power that cannot be ignored. That is why Jaishankar's words hit so hard. They were not empty. They carried the weight of one. 4 billion people, the legacy of thousands of years, and the confidence of a nation that no longer doubts its destiny. And when I say final strike, understand what that means. This wasn't about aggression. This wasn't about provocation. This was about precision. A strike so sharp, so perfectly timed, that the other side had no counter, no comeback, no narrative strong enough to resist. America was silenced because it had never faced an India this confident, this assertive, this prepared. For decades, Washington dictated terms, but now New Delhi dictates its own. That is why the U.S. sat back in silence, because they realized the world no longer bends automatically to their will. India's rise as a global power is undeniable. Look deeper and you will see this was not just about words. India had built the power to back those words, military strength that is modern and indigenous, an economy that is resilient and among the fastest growing in the world, technology that is cutting edge, from space exploration to digital payment systems, diplomacy that is strategic, balancing relationships with Russia, the U.S., Europe, Africa, and the Middle East all at once. This is not the India of yesterday, waiting to be told what to do. This is the India of today, deciding for itself, building for itself, and leading for others. And here is the truth. Real strength is not about shouting. Real strength is when you speak once and the world listens. That is exactly what happened. Jaishankar didn't need to shout. He didn't need to beg. He simply stated India's truth, and the silence in the room said everything. That silence was an acknowledgement. That silence was respect. That silence was fear, because for the first time, the United States and the West realized they were not the only power in the room. Now, let me tell you why this moment matters, because it marks the birth of a multipolar world. For too long, global politics has been dominated by one or two centers of power. Everyone else was expected to align, to follow, to fit into someone else's vision of the future. But India has changed that game. By rising on its own terms, by refusing to be pulled into one camp or another, by building bridges where others build walls. India has positioned itself as the balancing force the world desperately needs. And the beauty of it is this: India is not rising by crushing others, but by lifting others. Look at Africa, look at Southeast Asia, look at the partnerships India is building. This is not empire, this is leadership. And that is why the world is watching India with new eyes. But remember, none of this came easy. India has been tested again and again. Wars, sanctions, economic crises, external pressures. Every time, the world thought India would break. But every time, India came back stronger. That is the secret of this nation's rise. It is built on resilience. It is built on the ability to endure storms that would shatter others. And that resilience is what makes India terrifying to those who would want to suppress it. Because you cannot control a nation that thrives under pressure. You cannot silence a voice that grows louder after every attempt to suppress it. That is India's strength. That is what the U.S. realized when they went silent. Think of it as a story. For centuries, India was told it was too weak, too divided, too poor to matter. The West wrote books, made speeches, delivered reports, all claiming India was always emerging, but never arrived. And India listened, patiently, silently, but while the world was underestimating it, India was building its defense industry, building its IT sector, building its space program, building its infrastructure, and building a new generation of confident Indians who are not afraid to lead. So, when JAISHANKAR delivered that strike, it was not the sound of arrogance. It was the sound of justice. It was the sound of a nation finally demanding recognition for what it had already become. And let me tell you, nothing terrifies the powerful more than a nation that no longer needs their approval. That's why America went silent, because approval is their currency. They thrive on being the ones to validate others. But India doesn't need validation anymore. India is validating itself. India is standing on its own feet, shaping its own destiny and offering others a model of independence. That is dangerous for the old order. Because when one nation breaks free, others start to follow. This is the ripple effect of JAISHANKAR'S strike. It wasn't just about India versus the U.S. It was about the entire developing world watching and learning. Nations across Africa, Latin America, and Asia saw India standing tall and thought, if India can do it, why not us? If India can negotiate with strength, why not us? If India can build independence, why not us? That's the true power of this moment. It's not just about India's rise. It's about India lighting the path for others to rise. And that is why the silence in that room was global. It wasn't just Washington falling quiet. It was the whole world realizing that the game had changed. Now understand this, JAISHANKAR'S strength comes not from threats, but from clarity, from being brutally honest, yet calm, from refusing to sugarcoat reality. When he speaks, he doesn't just represent a government. He represents the voice of 1 billion people who are tired of being underestimated. And that is why his words carry such weight. Because they are not just words. They are the reflection of a nation's soul, a nation that has suffered, struggled, sacrificed, and finally risen. And here is what the U.S. cannot grasp. India's rise is inevitable because it is not driven by ambition alone, it is driven by destiny. A civilization this old, this vast, this resilient cannot be kept down forever. You can delay it, you can challenge it, but you cannot stop it. That is why the silence of the U.S. is not temporary, it is permanent. Because deep down, they know this is not India's peak. This is only the beginning. India is not done. India is still rising, and every year, every decade, that rise will only grow stronger. Picture it, a new world order where no one nation controls everything. Where voices from the East matter as much as voices from the West. Where Africa, Asia, Latin America stand shoulder to shoulder with Europe and America. And at the center of that balance, India stands as the bridge, as the leader, as the power that connects. That is the world being born right now, and JAISHANKAR'S final strike was the sound of that birth. The silence of the U.S. was the admission that the old world is gone. The future belongs to balance, and balance belongs to India. So let me leave you with this truth. In life, just like in geopolitics, the ones who rise are not always the loudest, not always the flashiest, but the ones who build silently, endure patiently, and strike decisively. That is what India has done, that is what JAISHANKAR showed the world, and that is why the U.S., for the first time in a long time, had nothing to say. India has risen, India is leading, and the world will never be the same again. It marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine backed by innovation, the moment when the world finally realized that India was no longer testing waters or cautiously navigating great power politics, but rather setting its own course with confidence and clarity, because for decades, the global perception of India had been framed around the word emerging, a label that implied incompleteness, a sense of not yet ready, as if India were always on the way but never quite there, and that label became a comfortable narrative for the West, one they repeated in reports, in media, in summits, as if to keep India in a box. But what JAISHANKAR and the military doctrine that India now embraces proved is that India is not emerging anymore. It has arrived, and that arrival is not just economic or political, it is psychological, and psychology changes everything, because once you change the way others perceive you, power shifts immediately, alliances shift, respect changes tone, negotiations take a different shape, and the balance of the world begins to tilt. This doctrine is not about aggression, it is about preparedness. It is about ensuring that no adversary can dictate terms to India, and that assurance comes from innovation, from creating weapons, defense systems, and strategies that are not copied or borrowed, but indigenous and unique to India. Systems like the Akashan-G, the Agni missile family, the nuclear triad, and the expansion of India's naval power across the Indian Ocean, all of it rooted in a belief that India must never again be dependent on foreign suppliers to secure its sovereignty, because dependence is weakness, and independence is the true definition of power. And with this shift, India declared to the world that it is not waiting for others to grant it status. It is building its own. The psychological transformation here is massive, because when the West called India emerging, they positioned themselves as the gatekeepers of success, as if it was their job to decide when India would finally arrive. But when India showed its doctrine, its vision, its capabilities, the power of that old label collapsed, and India ripped off the tag and replaced it with its own definition. Not an emerging market, but a decisive global power, not waiting to be recognized, but demanding recognition through undeniable capability, because the real battlefield is not always land or air or sea. The real battlefield is perception, and when perception shifts, everything shifts with it. This is why JAISHANKAR'S diplomacy resonates, because it is anchored in this military and strategic confidence. When he speaks to the U.S., or to Europe, or to any forum, he speaks from the seat of a nation that has the ability to defend itself, to project power, to innovate at scale, and to set terms. And when a nation speaks from that position, its words cannot be dismissed. That is why the U.S. fell silent, because for the first time they were not speaking to a dependent partner. They were speaking to a rival equal, a rival with its own doctrine, its own vision, and its own ability to enforce it. And that silence was the recognition of a rival. Consider how far India has come from the time when its military relied almost entirely on imports, when Western analysts dismissed its defense as outdated, when narratives painted India as vulnerable, to now, when India is exporting weapons to other nations, building its own fighter jets, expanding its space program into defense technology, and integrating artificial intelligence into its security architecture. This is not just growth. It is transformation, and transformation this deep cannot be ignored, because it changes the psychological standing of a nation on the global stage. It changes the way adversaries calculate their moves, it changes the way allies treat you in negotiation, and it changes the way ordinary citizens view their own nation, filling them with pride and confidence that cannot be bought. The psychological shift is also visible in how India negotiates, once cautious, defensive, trying to appease multiple sides at once, but now bold, unapologetic, clear in its stance, whether it is about purchasing Russian oil despite Western sanctions, or refusing to be dragged into Western wars, or demanding equal treatment in global forums. India no longer speaks like an emerging nation, it speaks like a nation that knows its own power, that knows its presence is indispensable, that knows the world cannot move without its participation, and that tone is what silences others, because when you act like you have arrived, others have no choice but to treat you as such. This doctrine is also visible in India's expanding naval strategy, securing the Indian Ocean, monitoring vital trade routes, building alliances with island nations, because whoever controls the seas controls the flow of global commerce, and India understands that it cannot allow adversaries to dominate waters so vital to its security, so it builds aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, and advanced maritime surveillance. This is not the work of an emerging power. This is the behavior of an established one, a power that knows it is central to the world's future. And when nations see India projecting power across oceans, they cannot dismiss it as regional, they recognize it as global, and the role of innovation cannot be understated, because innovation is the mark of independence. It means you do not wait for someone else to hand you tools, you create your own, and India has embraced that path, from missile defense to space-based assets, from quantum computing to cyber warfare capabilities. This innovation sends a message that India is not just consuming technology, it is creating it, shaping it, and exporting it, and that message shifts perception, because the label of emerging belongs to those who are still dependent, and India is not dependent anymore. It is self-sufficient and increasingly self-reliant. And that is the hallmark of arrival. The arrival is also cultural and civilizational. Because while military doctrine and innovation are tangible signs, the deeper transformation is in how India views itself, no longer content with being called a developing country, no longer willing to be lectured on democracy or human rights by nations with histories of colonization, no longer afraid to stand alone when necessary. This self-belief, this civilization confidence is what underpins the doctrine, because weapons alone do not make a nation strong. It is the spirit behind them, the belief that you deserve to lead, that you deserve to decide your path. And India has embraced that belief with a clarity the world cannot ignore. When the U.S. went silent in the face of JAISHANKAR'S words, it was not just about one man's rhetoric. It was about the realization that India's psychological transformation was complete, that this was no longer the India of compromise and caution. This was an India that had arrived, that had backed its words with doctrine, with innovation, with resilience, and with confidence. And once that shift happens, once the world sees you differently, you cannot be put back into the box of emerging. You are recognized as what you are, and what India is now, is a global power that will shape the 21st century. The doctrine also shows that India has learned from history. It has seen how dependence on others in times of crisis leads to vulnerability. It has seen how being reactive leaves you at the mercy of stronger players, so it has decided never again will India allow its future to be dictated by outsiders. And that decision, backed by innovation, backed by resilience, backed by doctrine, is what gives JAISHANKAR'S words their force, because every time he speaks, every time he challenges the old order, he speaks from the position of a nation that is no longer waiting for permission, a nation that is no longer rising, but a nation that has arrived, and arrival changes everything. It changes trade, It changes defense. It changes alliances. It changes how the future is written. And when India made that psychological leap from emerging to arrived, it was not just India that changed. The world changed with it. Because the old system cannot survive when new powers stand tall. And India is not just standing tall. It is moving forward with unstoppable momentum. Momentum backed by its people, by its military, by its innovation, and by its destiny. A momentum that no silence, no opposition, no outdated label can hold back.